I do that.
This is Judson Sapp. You're listening to Never Off Duty. Okay, so first question. Have you ever been shot at or taken a bullet?
Shot at? No. Had a gun put to my head? Yes. Had a gun put to my stomach? Yes. Actually, I have been shot at. Just it was a little bit of a distance. Heard the bullets whiz by, but never shot.
Okay. Now, if you're wondering, that was Sheriff Michelle Cook of Clay County. I'm Judson Sapp, and I'm going to have each of you. We have another guest here. Andrew is here with us, an officer with her.
A deputy.
Sorry, I messed that up.
Come on, Judson.
I know. Well, it's good that I messed that up because eventually we're going to talk about the difference between a police force and a sheriff's office.
Yes.
And we could eventually go into the weirdness of Jacksonville, which is a sheriff's office, but city, but
city county consolidated.
Yeah. So I know it gets a little weird there, and I'm sure there's many jurisdictions all over the United States where it's not exactly play out like you think it should play out with titles, but sheriff, deputy. So I'll let you each introduce yourself.
Sure.
And I'm pointing towards the sheriff first.
Ladies first,
because
right?
you can't
Ladies
see
first.
this, so go for it.
Thank you. So my name is Michelle Cook. I'm currently serving as the sheriff of Clay County in Clay County, Florida. I am a 30-year veteran of law enforcement and started out as a beat cop in Jacksonville in the early 90s and worked my way up through the ranks, retired as the director of operations for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, then became a chief of police for a small agency out at the beach on the coast in Duval County, Atlantic Beach Police Department. And then a couple of years ago, decided to run for sheriff in the county that I was born and raised in. And so that's me.
Yeah, and really quickly before we introduce our next guest, I think it's important for people listening to understand that there's a difference. And we'll talk more about this in future episodes. But a sheriff in Florida is an elected office. You're a constitutional office, and you have to go through an election process, and you're
Correct.
accountable towards the people. And that's very different from when you're hired as a police
chief. Yes, very different. Yep.
It's a fascinating difference, and I think it's something worthy to discuss one day, but not today, because this is the first episode, and we want to talk about other things today. By the way, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you as well.
No, that's a joke. We're going to only talk about this the first time. So the very first time Sheriff Cook and I met, she was running for office.
I was.
And we were introduced at an event about 50 times.
50 times, at least.
50 times.
And
it was ridiculous.
It was, yeah. And so we started playing it off as if it was the first time we'd met each other. So somebody would say, hey, Michelle, this is Judson. I want to introduce you to Judson Sapp. And I'd be like, pleasure to meet you. And he's like, pleasure to meet you. And then 2 minutes later, the next person's like, hey, Judson, I want you to meet Michelle Cook. And he's like, pleasure to meet you. And I'm like, pleasure to meet you too.
And you didn't miss a beat.
No.
I mean, it was just dead-faced, stone cold.
Right.
No, this is the first time I've ever met this person. And it was actually kind of fun. And we've done that many times since then as our inside joke that now our listeners so if you missed this first episode, when we do it again, you're not going to know why.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you.
And so there's at least 1,000 people in Clay County who go out and claim, I'm the one that introduced Michelle Cook and Judson Sapp.
So if you didn't get the first introduction right, at least by the 50th time you were introduced, you got
That's
it right.
true.
That
That's
is
true.
Because it is the worst when you don't know somebody's name and you're not reintroduced and you don't have your spouse or significant other there to ask them what their name is for you, especially if you're running for office.
Who is that?
That's when you go, hey, buddy. Hey, friend.
Yes, you do. Or you say, there was a couple sayings that I've heard before, but yeah, that's good. I'm going to have to use the hey, buddy.
Hey, buddy.
I know what it was. Good to see you.
Good to see
because
you.
what does that mean? It is good to see you. Even if I've never met you or if I've met you before, it's a good one. And so now when people hear me say that, they're going to know I don't know their name.
Or I can't remember if I've ever met you before. Good to see you.
Yeah. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
So I am Andrew Ford. I am the deputy with the Clay County Sheriff's Office. I am also the public information officer for the agency. I have 25 years law enforcement experience. Started with Philadelphia Police and did 12 years with them. After I left Philadelphia Police, I got hired with CSX Police, the railroad. A lot of people that know railroads, especially Class 1 railroads, have police departments. And so got hired with them, got promoted, moved down into D.C. for 3 years, and then came on down here to Florida, where I oversaw their security operations for several of their building locations. And then, unfortunately, through the layoffs, came here to the sheriff's office where, I've been serving here now for 5 years, and I've loved every minute of it.
Well, you've been doing a great job. I had the fortune to briefly meet you at a day with the deputies, and that's a program that we will talk more about later. So we're just going to keep writing down these things we say we're going to talk about. But it's one of the things that I really appreciate about Sheriff Cook and her office is they go out of their way to meet people, to introduce them to what they do and what they do for the community. And I think it helps. There's a lot of people, especially on social media, where they can hide behind there that say some unflattering things, and if they were there and they experienced just the day of the deputy, I think they're completely would change their perspective on law enforcement.
Which is why we talked about starting this podcast.
Yeah,
because for me, it is so frustrating when misinformation is presented. And historically, as a law enforcement agencies, we've had limited opportunity to communicate with the public. We've had limited opportunity to tell our story. Our story is often interpreted by traditional media reporters who either don't understand context, they have an agenda, or they're just in a hurry. And we get, a 10-minute story is a 15-second soundbite. So, part of the reason we wanted to be a part of this podcast was, now we have an opportunity to explain things to citizens, to take the time and explain things thoroughly, to take the time and to, talk about important issues and not just the 15-second blurb.
Oh, absolutely. And again, that's something that I think is great about what you do and what you bring to our county, because I'm a Clay County resident, and it's that effort to communicate.
Right.
That again, I think there's sheriffs and police chiefs all over that do an amazing job, but maybe they're just used to the old school way of doing this. And something like podcasting reaches a completely new audience. It's actually vastly superior than a lot of other formats.
So are you saying podcast listeners are vastly superior?
Well, I wouldn't ever use that word completely.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, that's called a slip of that is called something that will haunt me for the rest of my life when somebody goes, I'm not a podcast listener.
So for all of you people out there listening, you are vastly superior.
Well, that's true. You can have somebody else that's not listening tell them if they want to be. Just tune in.
Exactly.
It's very easy to share that link.
Listen to Never Off Duty.
I need to get to that point, so I'm going to start listening to a lot of podcasts.
Yes.
Next time I come in, I'm going to be vastly superior.
There you go. There you go. It's strangely addicting, so especially when you have a long drive.
Yes.
So
Yep, absolutely.
So let's talk about, before we take our first break, what we're going to do here. We've talked about who we are. Why we're doing this, I think, is a good point. We just talked about that with it's important to communicate. And you can actually ask questions if you want. Did you want to give them away, Sheriff Cook?
Sure. So if anybody has a specific question or topic they would like covered, if you'll email us at sheriff@claysheriff.com, and that is sheriff@claysheriff.com, we will pull those questions and we'll go through them and we'll start answering them.
There's a certain irony. So I was emailing you, the old sheriff. But he has a slightly different, or 2 sheriffs ago, Sheriff Beasler, because we're doing a nonprofit together, and we'll talk about that another episode. But anyways, I accidentally emailed his other email address, which was the old sheriff. So somebody's going to get that and be like, "Why did you?"
It didn't get kicked back, which means Sheriff Beasler is still active. Emails.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to have IT check into that.
IT's holding them all.
IT.
So, but do email because you will get a reply. I think.
Yes.
I think Sheriff Cook and her team are extremely accessible, and I think that's so important to the community. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what we're going to do format wise, just so you know. We basically have, for listeners, we have no idea what we're going to do. No, I'm just kidding. Sheriff Cook is a very, very great organizer. We've had a lot of meetings discussing how to do this. It will develop and change as we go over there. But some of the things we're going to do is, do you want to?
Some of the topics that we're going to discuss. Yeah.
Well, the format is going to be, we're going to basically.
Oh, yeah. Have 2 or 3 segments. And, so what we're thinking is. First segment or 2, we'll talk about big issues, national issues. And then what we can do is bring in deputies or people with really interesting stories to share their experiences. And then I want to really bring it back down to Clay County, like what's happening in Clay County, because I think it's so important to tell the story of what we're doing here locally. So I think we're looking at 2 or 3 segments each podcast. And again, open to the listeners out there. If you have something you want us to talk about, definitely email us at sheriff@claysheriff.com. Some of the specific topics we talked about is we have a great program here that we do on active shooter for schools, which I think is really cutting edge, and we'll talk about that.
Which I'm excited to hear that. I've got 2 young boys at a school here locally, and that's something that I'm on the board of that school. So anytime I hear things like that, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy about the plan. And the headmaster of my school spoke wonders about your department already, and they're being prepared for the worst case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's important to us. I think it's important to share. We're going to be bringing in our cold case detectives to talk about some open cold cases that we have here in Clay County. And then we've also reached out to Project Cold Case, which does cold cases all over. And so they've agreed to come in and talk about some of the cold cases that they have. We're going to be interviewing deputies and officers who've been injured or shot or involved in deadly force situations in the line of duty. Previous sheriffs, you mentioned Sheriff Beasler, which we are both a huge fan of, and just talk about what was it like when he was sheriff, and what was important to him at the time and what he's doing now. And there's always sage advice that he gives. And then, the surrounding counties, bringing those sheriffs in and talking to them. So there's some good stuff ahead.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
I think that you as a listener are going to very much enjoy this. And I would say even if you're not a Clay County resident, you're going to enjoy this a lot, because while we will talk about that, our county is kind of a microcosm of the rest of the United States. So when you can see what a sheriff's office. I just did it again.
Yeah.
I live in the city of Green Cove, so technically I've got a.
We need to have one of those zappers.
Zappers.
So when he says
I'm
police, I'm just going to zap.
I am notoriously, and what's funny is outside of this, I've never made that mistake other than today. So that's just going to be a reoccurring theme. If we ever have a local police chief on, I'll mess up and call them a deputy. So there we go. I'll be fair and do it on purpose. No, but if you live in this area or you don't live in this area, it is a great thing to listen to, because you're going to learn what you might be happening in your area, whether you're under a sheriff or a police chief.
Sure. And there's issues that all law enforcement faces.
Right.
And that we can provide some perspective on and some discussion about why does law enforcement do this, or why does law enforcement do that. So I'm looking forward to talking about the bigger issues that affect anybody anywhere they live. Especially,
I would say too, I know podcast listeners are huge people into cold cases. So that's one of the segments, and it's always a pleasure from a citizen talking to a sheriff, deputy, or an officer to hear their perspective of cold cases, because usually everybody's got one that just nags them. And look, they're sometimes small, and we'll get into one of yours that's not small to you, but I mean, it's not like a serial killer.
Right.
Could have been, but could have been. And that's what's fascinating, I think, to people. Now, I'm kind of squeamish, so I'm not I don't really listen to those, but I will be a glad host when that comes.
He'll wear earmuffs that day. That give the signal that it's over.
Yeah. Yes. We are broadcasting from my armory, if you must know. So I'm not squeamish. I mean, I will defend myself in a heartbeat. I'm a huge.
Just don't want to talk about it.
I'm not a ER walk into an ER kind of person.
That's
the fun stuff.
I know.
Yes,
I know,
it is.
yes.
Yeah.
See,
you
that's
get to see a lot.
That's the difference between us and you is we love that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, crime scene. I'm like, that's all right, you guys. This is why we pay you. Yep, that's right. So before we take our first break, though, let's talk about, because I let you do the quick shot at thing.
Yes.
And I think that's fascinating to people. And if you want to take a moment to go more in depth, I tease that we would just start with an action piece, but I needed to get the intro done. So do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Which one? Which time? So, when I first started on the street, I rode in a pretty rough area. And interestingly enough, back in the early 90s, there was not a lot of women in the Southeast United States in law enforcement. And I went to one of the commanders and I said, hey, I was brand new. And I said, listen, if I'm ever going to be considered credible, I need to work the toughest beat. And he looked at me, and listen, I'm 5'5" and 105 pounds at that time. A little heavier now. Not much. A little heavier, just for the record.
Still 105 pounds.
Yep,
Thank you.
I
You know what?
that.
That's why you're a happily married man, Andrew. So they put me in Springfield, which is at that time with the crack epidemic that was
having
going
grown
on.
up here. Yes, I know.
Yeah. So it was pretty rough, and I got my fill pretty quickly. So, but I was always, very proactive officer. And so the one of the times that I was shot at, I was chasing a car, and they pulled over in a neighborhood, and there was a two-door car, and the driver and the passenger get out and run, and the poor guy's stuck in the back seat, right? He jumps out. He's trying to get out, and I see him getting out, and he gets out the passenger side, and I draw my weapon down on him. And he points a gun back at me, and it was the little brother of one of my friends.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I'm just thankful I didn't shoot him. He didn't shoot me. He didn't shoot at me that day. He took off. He dropped the gun and took off running. I ended up catching him. I called his sister. I'm like, hey, you tell your brother to turn himself in. Yeah, that was pretty scary. And then one time I was at a domestic dispute, and I'd responded to this house several times, and I knew them by name, and they were boyfriend, girlfriend, and they would stay together until they fought, and then they'd separate, and then they'd come back together. So I'm knocking on the door. I get a call. Hey, I'm going to come up with a fake name. Mary Mary left her keys inside. John has them. They're fighting. So I knock on the door, and I'm like, John, Mary just wants her keys. And he's cursing. I mean, he's mad. He's cursing, but he's not cursing at me. And that's something officers or seasoned deputies will tell you. There's people that are mad, and then there's people that are mad at you, and you can pretty quickly distinguish that. So he's mad, he's cursing, he's calling her all kinds of names. And I said, just give me the keys, I'll get them to her, and, I'll tell her to stay away tonight. Well, he had his door partially propped open, and there was a screen door. And, when you talk to somebody at the door, typically if they go back inside and you don't follow him in because he didn't let me in, you move to a different position. Mm-hmm. Well, I had moved to a different position, unfortunately, and I look back at the backup officer that's with me to just let him know, hey, I got this. And I hear the screen door coming open, and I turn my head back towards him, and he put a gun to my head. And, wow. At that point, I just jumped backwards off of it was an older house that had a raised patio. I jumped backwards off the patio and retreated back to my car. So now this is back before everybody had portable radios. So I had to go back to my car and call for backup. And then I was able to get my shotgun, because back then we didn't have rifles, out of my trunk. And he went back in his house and came out with a rifle and was looking for me. And so, it was interesting because the SWAT, we had to call SWAT out, and the SWAT commander's like, what kind of gun did he have? And I'm like, it had 6 bullets in it, because I could see the cylinder.
It was this big.
It was this big. And it hit me right here between the eyeballs. So if my mom is listening to this podcast, I've never told her this story. So
goodness. She's not happy right now.
She's not happy right now. My phone will probably be ringing.
She's going to ask you to retire.
Yes. So that was one time. And then, gosh, I got several. Another time I chased this is funny, not funny, but, as law enforcement, sometimes we have cynical senses of humor. So there was a kid that I dealt with quite a lot. And whenever I'd call him over to talk to me, he'd come to me. And this time he took off running. I'm like, uh-oh, that's a clue. In police work, we call that a clue. Yeah. And so I take off running, and he runs into a store, and I run in right behind him. Well, he'd run into the store and run up to the counter, so he had nowhere to go. So he turns around, and he's got a gun. And I'm right behind him, right. So the gun hits me in my stomach. So we're on the ground fighting over the gun. And I'm calling him by name because I know this kid. And I'm like, you don't want to do this? You don't want to do this? Well, there was some firemen across the street, and I love firemen, but they were probably sleeping. And they heard the commotion. We have to get the fire chief.
We got to get the fire chief.
Yeah, he's going to.
My father-in-law was a fire chief up in Chicago area, in the suburbs. So, so he gives policemen there's a great friendly rivalry between the two departments.
Yes, like brothers and sisters, we fight, but we'll go out and fight everybody else. So. I'm fighting this kid, and the fireman heard the commotion and came in, and I got him secure, and And I'm like, I'm just wearing this, when I say wearing this out, verbally wearing this kid out, because I'm like, I know you. What are you doing? If you'd have just told me you had a gun, Anyway, so he ends up going to jail, and later that year, this is the funny, not funny part, get a call of a bicyclist hit by a car. So I pull up, and guess who it is?
The kid.
And he's laying on the ground. He's like, Miss Cook. And I'm like, well, this is what you get for pulling a gun on me. I didn't hit him, but, so we're waiting for rescue. And
Karma.
Karma, exactly. And he's like, I'm so sorry. I said, say you're sorry again. I'm so sorry. But those were probably, and I've had bullets whiz by my head a few times in shootouts. I heard them go by.
Not a great sound.
Not a great sound.
Not a great sound
you have a similar story?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah.
He's
from Philly. Of course he's
you're from Philly.
He's got a better story.
Philly police, just New Year's is one of the times. And listen, I've arrested many people who had guns on them. I've been fortunate not to have been shot at, but I have had guns pointed at me. But the several times where I worked New Year's Eve, guys are out on the corner and they're shooting guns up in the air. And me and my partner are in the car just driving, and, we hear pow, 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 just like that. And it was like, and so we're like, oh, shoot. But at the same time.
Is that really what you said?
It's not really what I said.
Okay.
But
just clarifying.
But so me and my partner was like, hey, it came from that way. And we see a group of guys. And as we're going, they don't see us. We're in an unmarked car. We were a burglary detail. So we were plain clothes. And so, but next thing you know, you hear kind of this pew. And you be like, oh, shoot. But I really didn't say, oh, shoot. And, and they weren't shooting at us, but one of them bullets whizzed past. And, so that was like, a couple of inches closer. Wow. So, we end up getting those guys, but hearing a bullet whiz by your ear is not the greatest sound you ever want to hear. Because you just don't know if you sit there and you play in your mind. If I was a couple of inches to that way, what would have happened at that point in time? So, it is a scary thing, but, it may sound a little crazy or strange, but one of the things for law enforcement, catching someone who shouldn't have a gun on them, and, the lack of a better term, the thrill of the chase, being able to catch them and do it safely, I think is one of the greatest and rewarding things you could ever do.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. I like that. Ironically, I have actually been shot at once, too. But it's another story for another time, and I was very young. It was here in Clay County. And
was it one of our deputies?
No. No, the deputies. So I'm 45 now. It was the first time I joined Boy Scouts.
You have to tell the story now.
Okay.
Okay, tell the story.
It ends up great. So I was a large child, and for some reason, my mom and dad thought it'd be a great idea to celebrate me joining Boy Scouts to take me to get a Snickers at the Jiffy store in Green Cove. This visual
is
I know, right?
He's not a large guy now.
No, I got in shape, but ish. I got to get better.
Right
Shape-ish.
But it was actually Fleming Island when Fleming Island was dirt roads and the sticks, and nobody wanted to live there.
That's where I lived.
Okay, so you know, and you probably know the Jiffy I'm talking about. There was like one on the south side near the Black Creek Bridge.
Yes.
Between there. It's where the Publix is now.
Yep.
And anyway, so we stopped in. My mom went into the store, and it turns out they were being robbed. Now my dad was in the driver's seat, and he knew, like he kind of just had that. So he went into what people that concealed carry call Code Red, where he was ready to go. Something went wrong, right. And he told me, get in the floorboard. Because he thought that when he saw my mom wouldn't have gone in if it wasn't for that. So they put her in the back in the freezer. They came out, then decided they wanted the car too, and were going to take me with it. Now my dad wasn't going to let that happen, but the second he drew, they ran. But as they were running, they were shooting back.
Right.
And that was where and as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, it's you're petrified. I didn't sleep that night.
Your dad has never told me this story.
Oh, it was amazing.
Oh, wow.
It really was. He probably, and that was one of the things that I've heard is it's probably would not have ended well had they taken me in the car.
Right.
And he knew that. Now, obviously, I probably was terrified, but I know that now. I mean, I would never let somebody take my car with my kids in it.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Or my wife or anybody else, because I think statistically the chances of something ending worse rather than solving it there
absolutely.
are there. So that was my little getting shot at, but I still remember it to this day.
What year was that? Do you remember?
Oh boy,
Because my dad worked at that store.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Well, I'll have to find that out. We'll find that out, and we will talk about it on a future episode if we find out there's a correlation there, because that would be really fascinating to find out. But wow, what a small world. So listen, we did a great little intro segment. I hope you enjoyed. And we're going to take a short break, and we will come back and discuss a little bit more. You're listening to Never Off Duty. Okay, and we are back. So during the break, we started talking, because this is what you do when you're in a room with people. You just start talking, and
when you're in a room with cops.
Oh, yeah. Which is why we went. I want to pause, jump back, which is why I asked the first question about being shot at, because normally, and I've been around a lot of deputies in public, a person who's never spoken with a deputy, that is usually one of the first questions out of their mouth. That's what they want to know about.
Shot.
Yeah. So that's why we did that. But so we were talking about the break, and we were talking about crime around the United States, and immediately we jumped into, which we'll talk about this, and then we'll go back and talk about crime around the United States, but the different areas. It's a world of difference of, like, city of Chicago is, there are parts that there's no crime, there's suburbs where there's no crime, and then there's areas that make the crime numbers for the entire city, and that's what everybody judges it by. Right. So it's very, from my perspective, I hear, oh, this area, but then as somebody that knows law enforcement a little bit better than some others, I can go, okay, well, it's probably not the whole thing. So so we were talking about being from Philadelphia.
Yes.
And immediately I jumped to, oh yeah, that's got to be horrible. But there's, like you said, there's a world of difference from where each area.
Yeah, it's Philly. Philly has so many surrounding suburbs, where crime is generally low. And not to say that Philly is just a bad place to live. It's not. It's a beautiful city with some great tourism sites for people to go see.
And a so-so football team.
Go Birds. I don't want to say that right now. But
they are the best, nicest fans.
Sorry to digress. He is the most obnoxious Philadelphia Eagles football fan. Go ahead, Drew. Go ahead with your story. I'm sorry.
When you talk about the old Veterans Stadium where they actually held court just because of, some of the issues with Eagles fans, but that's a whole nother topic. But Philadelphia is a beautiful city. It's got some surrounding counties where crime is generally just low. And Philly is one of those places where the trend is down, but what gets the most is because of the shootings, and so, and then I tell people, oh, well, if I go there, there's certain areas in Philadelphia you can go to and you feel safe. And then, you go downtown, you go to some of the historic sites, people can, feel safe there. Cause, Philly police do a great job. My brother, I have a brother and sister-in-law.
He's got a twin brother, right?
A twin brother, who's a sergeant with Philly police, getting ready to get promoted. And so it's a great place, I tell people to go and visit. While sometimes you look at the numbers, and you say, oh, crime is really skyrocketing there. The shootings itself, where it looks like they're maybe up, but the overall crime statistics are down for the city. But again, we all know what's the one bad rep that, you get when it comes to something like that. And it's the shootings, it's the homicides,
right?
But a great city. But you see that, I think sometimes you see that across, all the nation, where, some of those, shootings are, in your kind of large populated areas are on the rise.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when you have 24/7 media coverage, and when I say 24/7 media, not only traditional media, but social media coverage, you'll have an incident that'll replay over and over and over again. And so people will perceive that has happened multiple times when really it's an older incident that is just replaying. Crime across the country in general, I tell you what we're seeing is fentanyl. The open borders and the drugs coming across. It is, in my opinion, worse than the crack epidemic of the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's terrible. And, so that is an issue that we see across the nation. There is a little bit of an uptick across the nation in violent crime. And part of it in my opinion, is because during COVID, a lot of our numbers went down. So people were at home. Ironically, domestic violence issues went up, but the majority of crime went down because people were at home. So they weren't on the roads, with road rage. Their houses weren't being broken in because they were at home. So now we've come out of COVID. People are still a little bit of anxiety because of being locked in their house for a year and a half, 2 years. And so we are seeing a little bit of an uptick nationally of violent crime. But to Drew's point, most places are safe in America. Most places are safe. There are pockets of unsafe places. But don't let a media narrative or a tweet that's been shared 5,000 times define a community or a city.
That's that perception.
That's that perception.
Give it that perception, and that's unfortunate.
Well, and also it's hard from a person who experiences this to understand, but the reality is cities today are vast and huge. Our states are vast. Our population has grown so much.
Absolutely.
And when you hear a number, that percentage sounds bad, but really, if you take it into perspective, like if you were to take M&Ms and throw them many people and pull out the bad M&Ms, you'd go, wow, that's not that many M&Ms.
Right. And
it's very hard to abstractly understand that, but I hope that our listeners will help other people understand that. So when you hear a number, when you hear something going on, it does sound frightening, but it's also, it's like if you hear about a plane crash, there's so many flying today. You're fine. You're going to be fine.
I hate flying
too.
I do because there's been plane crashes.
But statistically, you're fine.
You're safer than being in a car.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because I said something to the sheriff one time, and I don't know if it was this week or last week. And when we talk about crime, if there's a crime that never happened in Clay County, but it's on the books, it's in the stats, and then that one particular crime happens. And then someone says, oh, that crime's up 100%.
Yep.
Well, we didn't have it last year.
Right.
So it just happened one time. So now you want to add that number and skew it like crime's up. And that's not the case. You have to look at the totality.
You have to look at the raw numbers.
Absolutely.
And especially communities like Clay County, we're the 25th largest county in the state of Florida. So we're a decent size, mid-size community. But our raw numbers are so low when it comes to crime. And so we could have, 2 burglaries last week, and we have 644 square miles, and then maybe 3 this week, and somebody says, oh, your burglaries are up 50%. And, going from 2 to 3, listen, any crime is not good, right? But you gotta be able to dissect the numbers and the information that is given to you. And then I'll go back to what I said earlier about traditional media. And nothing against reporters, but the vast, vast majority of reporters are very young. They don't understand context. They don't understand the numbers, or they have an agenda because they want to make somebody look bad. And so burglaries are up 50%, and that makes everybody fearful, when in reality it went from 2 to 3.
Well, you have a much nicer view of media than me. So.
This is our first episode. I'm trying not to make any enemies.
No, but you brought up a good point, and it is true. I think it's a twofold thing. One, you'll have somebody reporting on a stat because they read it,
right?
And they're doing it from the perspective. They're not intentionally doing this. They just are. It's like, oh, like you said, oh, it's up 100%. And they don't take the time to go in the in-depth, like you said.
Right.
And that's I don't think I think most vast majority of reporters, it's not malice. It's just, it's like if you asked me to go, I don't know, some job I don't know how to do, go fix a diesel engine. I know the basics of it, but I'd probably mess it up without,
right.
going really in depth on YouTube and making sure I'm studying everything before I do it. And I think that's the problem is on the surface, it sounds great, but they don't really understand it. Now, if you ask me to diagnose a plumbing problem, I do know that. I'm like, okay, I don't need it. I can probably fix this for you right away.
Right.
And that's my area of expertise. So that
well, it's like the difference between homicide and murder. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between a homicide and murder. A homicide is the death, the unnatural death of a human being. A murder is I killed you.
Right.
Well, you can have homicides that are justified. I mean, you can have, so they'll say, well, there's been, 100 homicides. Well, maybe there was only 80 murders. And again, I'm not sure if it's malice, an agenda, or just not understanding the difference between homicide and murder.
Right. I totally agree. And I think, well, I'll give a great example too is manslaughter. You sometimes hear that word thrown around and you're thinking, and I have seen the media do this, like, oh, they committed manslaughter. And it's a horrible thing, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily at fault.
Right.
And that's what people don't understand. And it's the choice of words and the way that a reporter chooses to frame it that can actually really ruin somebody's image when they didn't do anything. It could have been completely out of their control.
Right.
And that's very unfortunate. But there's also a lot of good reporters, and we appreciate them. The ones that do the ones that do the yeah.
Sorry.
There's a few more out there. I got to work with them.
Yeah, Drew has to work with us. So this is not Drew. For the reporters that are listening, this is not Drew Ford saying these statements. And I'll just give you an example, and then I'll go into some Clay County statistics because I think that's important. But for the, especially for people listening in Clay County, but for really anybody, we will have an incident happen, okay, and the media reaches out to Drew, and we are at a point early on in an investigation where we don't even know exactly what happened, or we don't know who was involved because we have to confirm identities. And so the news will get on to say XYZ happened in Clay County, and we've reached out to the sheriff's office, but they have yet to respond to our request for information. Well, that sounds very adversarial, when the reality is we may not know the whole story. We don't want to put out erroneous information, or we may not know who's involved, or we haven't done family notifications. And it's not that we don't want to tell the media, but we have to we have to figure out what's going on first, and then let the families know before we announce it to the world. And so when media makes statements like, they have yet to respond for our request for information, that drives me nuts.
Crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, and that is perfectly explained from a citizen perspective. I'm a CEO. I run a company. And so when I get called, really things have either probably fallen apart. And so it's usually bad, but I'll get calls like that where it's not the press calling, but it's somebody and they go, well, did you see what happened? And I'm like, you just woke me up at 4 a.m. No, like you got to give me a second. Like, what do you think? So
that sounds familiar.
That's very familiar.
Yeah. But worse for y'all because literally, it's not that you 100%, the two of you know your jobs. There's 100%, but there can be a time delay, and sometimes it could be just 5 minutes. If you had to call 5 minutes later, that's the way it would be. But that's the problem is people expect you to know everything instantly. And sometimes you got to be briefed. You got to find the data,
right,
and before you can give an answer.
And you got to understand that as new information is learned, a lot of times the story changes, and it's not that anybody is telling a fib. It's just when you interview different people, everybody has their view or their perspective of what's happened, and you get the picture after you talk to everybody. So speaking of having to know everything all the time,
oh, there we go.
I'm going to segue into some Clay County stats. And
she's doing this off the top of her head.
I am, off the top of my head with my document in front of me. Listen.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the thing people don't look at. We're in general contracting. You have to take exams and all this, but guess what? Most general contractors still have their book. They look things up because they're going, I just want to make sure.
Yeah. Well, these are the numbers as of a couple of days ago, and these are not our final numbers, but they give you an idea of what we're dealing with. So we handle just shy of just around 250,000 calls for service a year here in Clay County.
Wow.
250,000 calls for service. We cover 644 square miles. So we're busy. I mean, we're busy people. And of those calls, let me see here. Let me tell you how many we had that were 911 calls. Over 20,000 911 calls.
Wow.
So what's 20,000 divided by 365?
I was not a mathematician in school.
You got a calculator?
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot. That's Clay County math right there. Clay County math.
It's a lot. I love that.
It's a lot.
That's a great answer.
We're busy. And our numbers look really good actually. Now I will tell you a couple of things. that I want people to think about. So when communities or agencies come out and say they've reduced crime, well, you're never going to get to net zero. So what does reduced crime look like? And, if you have an agency that says I reduced crime by 50%, well, next year, if you do it another 50%, you should be at net zero, right? And so I don't like that whole, relying too much on the phrase "we've reduced crime." I think you should have a sort of a baseline based on population, and then go from there. So let's see. We're looking at we did over 20,000 traffic stops.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry, we've issued over 20,000 tickets on traffic stops. We are a big believer in education than enforcement. So
your department. I'm going to talk about this for just 1 second, if you don't mind.
Ahead.
So I'm going to throw my wife into this. So my wife had her car serviced down the road, and they turned off her automatic lights. So I had a meeting. So her and her friend went to the Alhambra Dinner Theater and saw a show, the two girls, and they came back at night. And, the streets are pretty bright. But in Clay County, one of your deputies, pulled her over. And from a woman getting pulled over at night can be a lot more intimidating than that. And what was great is, first of all, he did a phenomenal job of making her feel comfortable. That was the first thing she said when she got home. She's like, I was so nervous. I didn't know what I did wrong. But he educated her.
Right.
And wrote a warning, which I thought was appropriate. And knowing that I know the sheriff and all that, I want to make very clear, nobody, I doubt there's
no favoritism shown here.
I doubt there's any deputy that I did it again. Darn, I was keep track.
Zap.
Yep, I need a zapper. But I doubt there's any deputy that knows that we know each other.
Right.
But just did a great job. And I think that's the difference is there are other departments where somebody might have, been very gun ho about that.
Right.
And great. You're allowed to. It's the law.
Well, and we give our deputies discretion, and based upon the totality of the circumstances, you have discretion, and traffic stops are one of those areas that they have discretion on how to handle.
And that is great. But again, he didn't. I'll get you his name because I was like, you need to know that,
Absolutely.
Especially because again, nighttime, woman who's scared and has already heard all these stories that are fake about getting pulled over at night. But in your mind, that's how it works. And she was like, it was just made me feel so comfortable.
Good.
And that's what you want in a police or sheriff's department.
Sheriff's department.
I said police or sheriff's department.
Sheriff's department.
Okay.
There you go.
Gotcha.
All right. So we had just over 200 person crimes. And in our world, a person crime is abduction, kidnap, false imprisonment. I don't think we had any actual stranger danger. Most of those cases end up being boyfriend, girlfriend. They're fighting in the car, and one of them locks the door so the other one can't get out. Technically, under the statute, it's a false imprisonment.
Okay.
Ag assault, ag battery, attempted murder, homicide, murder, rape, sex battery, robbery to business, robbery carjacking, robbery home invasion, robbery person. So just over 200. The good news is that it's actually down a little bit from last year by about a dozen cases, and we've cleared half of them. So for me, one of the big things you want to look at is what is your clearance rate? Are you arresting people for these crimes? And so for us, on our persons crimes, 50% of the time we are, which is very good.
Yeah, that's a great number.
Yeah, on our property crime. So property crime for us is arson, auto theft, burglary to auto, burglary to business, burglary to residence, burglary to a vessel, dealing in stolen property, grand theft, and petty theft. Our numbers are up, but by only 7 incidents over last year.
Again, if you think of that from the M&M analogy I did earlier, if you have 1 million M&Ms and you add 7, that's not. You have 250,000 M&Ms and we add 7. That's really
And at the time of this report, we had 1,947 of them, and we had cleared right at 650.
Wow.
So again, a really good clearance rate. We are seeing a definite decline in our domestic violence numbers, and we'll talk about that on another show. But we take a very proactive approach to domestic violence here in Clay County, and we're proud of the work that we do. And I think that the fact that our number of domestic violence cases continue to go down is a result of the good work by the detectives and the victims advocates that work on them. So crime here in Clay County is I think we're in a really good spot, especially as we're we're a very fast growing county. I think they have 10,000 homes permitted just for the Lake Asbury Green Cove area to build. So we're growing very fast, and our goal is to continue to provide a level of service and keep crime low with the limited resources that we have.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk more about resources in a completely different episode because I think that's something
take like 2 episodes.
Oh, we could probably talk about it every episode forever. It's constantly, from what I see from my perspective, and I see this nationwide, every department needs more, but they make do with what they have because they're passionate about their job and keeping people safe.
And that's really what that's what makes a good law enforcement officer or law enforcement deputy is the passion to keep the community safe.
Yeah. So we're going to have a lot for you to listen to over the next couple of weeks, hopefully longer. If you don't like it, I guess we'll stop, but I hope you do. Tell your friends about it and tune in each week. We'll try to get them out every Monday. If we're late, it's probably because the deputies were busy solving crimes that immediately propped up and why they're not here.
That's excellent. Thank you, Judson. Yeah.
Well, so tune in again to Never Off Duty.